This is KYRS, Medical Lake Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. You're listening to, KYRS. And we have a special guest in the studio today. We actually pre-recorded a speech that took place at Auntie's Bookstore in downtown Spokane. And the speech was all about co-housing. There was an expert there on site discussing it, and then there was a Q&A following. We felt it was really important to get this kind of information out to our community. It's a fascinating concept, and I know that I am just intrigued by it. And in the studio right now, we have Mariah McKay, who is the founder of the Spokane Cohousing Developments that is taking place up on South Hill on Perry. And I'm going to let her introduce our pre-recording and let us know what's going on here in Spokane with cohousing.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. The first thing I'll say is that this project is being underwritten and advanced by several families who have come together collaboratively to bring this unique residential format to our region. And the speaker who we will hear from in a moment is actually the project architect whom we have retained to design our community with us. So his name is Charles Durrett, and he is, along with his partner, Katie McCament, one of the fathers of the cohousing movement in the U.S. Him and Catherine McCament brought the cohousing model over from Denmark in the early 80s and have been developing these unique communities across the country ever since.
So before we run the recording of the speech, I don't know anything about this, and I find this so completely fascinating. I mean, the way that the world is going right now, there's this quote about problems cannot be solved using the same consciousness that created it. I think that was Einstein that said that. And we're doing the same old things over and over again. And what you are sort of offering is something completely different. And I think that's what it's going to take to really sort of do something for this world and to cause a lot of change and growth. And I mean, the speech was amazing. So I'm glad that we're letting people listen to this. So, is there anything else you want to say before we just go ahead and play this? Like maybe how people could see what's going on and get involved?
Yes, we definitely have a website I invite everyone to visit. You can learn more about our local project at SpokaneCohousing.com. We also have lots of live entertaining updates on our Facebook page, also under the name Spokane Cohousing currently. And what is cohousing? It is clustered private dwellings with generous common amenities. So it is not a commune, which is a common misperception.
I actually asked that question earlier.
Yes. Yeah. And so in cohousing, legally, these communities are structured like a condominium association. And you can, if you have life circumstances that change, you can sell your unit on the open market, just like you would if you were to live in a development like, for example, Kendall Yards. So there's nothing particularly special or innovative about the legal structure. The innovation and the context for a stronger community come into the design elements incorporated into the village and the intent of the residents who co-create it together to live in a more collaborative and supportive fashion by sharing childcare, taking turns cooking meals for neighbors, wholesome activities of that regard. So you have as much privacy as you want in the comfort of your own home whenever you want to be left alone, but also a rich social environment at your front doorstep and in what's called a common house, which is a larger facility with ample kitchen, dining hall. Oftentimes they include either a workout space or a kid's playroom or the shared laundry facilities and the mailboxes. Guest bedrooms, so that you don't have to have lots of extra space on the rare occasion that the in-laws come over during the holidays.
I hear there's one lawnmower.
That's something we aspire to achieve, yes. One snowblower, one lawnmower. not having a lot of duplicative appliances, when those things can be best used as a shared resource.
So this is, from an outsider in layman's terms, it's sort of like taking the block that you live in, and all of a sudden you know all of your neighbors. If there's something that you need, you know that you can walk down there and get a cup of sugar. You know that you know their names. You know that if they need a ride somewhere, that they won't hesitate to come and ask you for it. And if you need something, you wouldn't hesitate to ask them for something. It really is like a big extended family, but you still have your privacy. And, children will grow up knowing they have someone to turn to, someone to talk to, because, it is a village. And that's how I see it. And I just think it's an amazing thing that you're doing here in Spokane. And I hope that people take the time to actually really listen to this. There were some things that he said that were just like, ding, made my brain go, wow, that is what it should be everywhere. If you can't afford to have, an architect come in and build you this, make it, right? Make it in your neighborhood. Go down, the block on either side and get to know them. That's kind of what it's about, right?
Yes, there are many co-housing communities that have been built into existing neighborhoods. There are challenges with reorienting traditional neighborhood to be conducive to co-housing because of the way in which much of our society is very automobile-centric. And in co-housing, one of the key principles is to get the space for cars out of the middle of the village and put it on the periphery, where people park their cars and then they walk into the interior of the village to their front doorstep. There's carts and people to help you if you're moving furniture or anything of a heavy nature. But the cars are not going to run over or threaten a child. They're not going to be creating a lot of noise, starting up and turning off.
And I'm guessing that people share cars.
Yes, that's something we're very interested in exploring. And so currently we have about a dozen families invested in the project, and we have room for about 24 more. So we are looking for future neighbors to embark on this journey with us. We have an incredibly beautiful 3-acre site in the Perry District, and we are offering site tours on a regular basis. People can sign up for our newsletter and hear about our site tours that we offer regularly by visiting SpokaneCohousing.com and subscribing to our newsletter there. And we can also be found on Facebook at Spokane Cohousing.
Thank you, Mariah, very much. Yes, that was great. Wow, well, thank you guys for coming, and thanks very much to Aunties for hosting this. It's definitely my favorite topic, and I'm seeing that people want closer and louder. Okay. Oh, and we have the bleachers back there and the stairs. That works. That's good. My favorite topic. When I was a kid, I grew up in a town of 325 people, very much a community, no doubt about it. My parents were separated. My mother lived in Sacramento, quite different. Year after year, I noticed a huge chasm in social dynamic between those two settings. One was a setting where everybody knew each other, everybody cared about each other, and everybody supported each other. And another one was quite anonymous, quite atomized, quite estranged by comparison. Certainly the land planning had a lot to do with it, and the connections that people did or didn't have had a lot to do with it. And in a small town, everyone has an excuse to run into each other, whether it's at school or the library or city affairs, or at the hardware store or at the cafe. There was just a lot of relationship. So Denmark, co-housing got started in Denmark. The first one was built there in 1972. And the Danes were very quick to say that, they're not doing anything new. They're just recreating what used to happen naturally. When the development was less bureaucratic, it was more organic. When it was less money-driven, it was more need-driven. And where people were much more involved in a more organic creation of a town than they are today. For the most part, very rarely do residents play a big role in the creation of their new neighborhood. And co-housing is just the opposite of that. These 11 households that are involved right now are playing a very hands-on role in the creation of the neighborhood because, frankly, no one can do it better. Nobody can do it better. I've designed about 55 co-housing now, and people often ask me, hey, Chuck, why don't you just design it? Why don't you you know what to do. Why don't you just draw something up? I'm an architect. And I have to say that over and over again, I find that it's a better community with their participation. Real people bringing real experiences, real values to the table makes a real neighborhood. And frankly, I consider a neighborhood a key component to our quality of life and very much a missing component to our quality of life. I mean, we all have a social network. We're social animals. But it's very much based on our car, our telephone, our date book. I first learned about co-housing when I was going to the University of Copenhagen in 1980. And on my walk to the train station every day, I noticed that, the regular suburbs, there was little to no life between the buildings. Regular apartments, little to no life. Regular condominiums, little to no life. Just really no life between the buildings. But day after day, I kept walking by this one development where people were stopping to talk to each other. People were sitting down at the picnic table and having a cup of tea together. People were coming and going from this building where apparently nobody lived, but everybody lived, the common house there. And in the creation of that common house and the creation of that neighborhood, they grew a very distinct and palpable community. One day I stopped and asked somebody in my broken Danish, what's going on here? What is happening here? Why is this so different? Why is it so obviously different than all the rest of the housing for miles? And this woman replied in her perfect English that, her and her husband had grown up in very high-functioning neighborhoods. And they knew what that brought to their quality of life. They knew what that brought to their childhood, to their development. And they wanted their two children, to grow up in high-functioning neighborhood as well, because they didn't want their kids to be deprived of those relationships that are not only grow to be somewhat meaningful, but most importantly, they're proximate. They're just outside the door. My 2-year-old daughter, with pacifier in mouth and drooping diapers, would walk out the door at 8:30 in the morning because her parents were boring, and be able to go and hang out with other 2-year-olds and 5-year-olds and 10-year-olds and other people that made it possible for us to accomplish one of our goals, which was to only have one child. And, Jesse is extremely social, and so it would have been nothing less than abusive. Plenty of people have 2 children just so that the first one will have company. Sometimes that works. But now she has 30 cousins. And now she's 26 and goes to Princeton in graduate school. But she worked for the UN for 4 years. She's had quite a trajectory. I mean, I'm not going to just talk about my kid, but since you asked, no. Growing up in co-housing has meant for her that she's not intimidated about any argument. She's not intimidated about any conflict. She's not intimidated by different opinions. She's not in any way threatened by that. And she's extremely skilled at helping find a common ground and extremely skilled in bringing the best out of people. And I would, Kate and I both attribute that to having grown up in co-housing since she was 1 year old. So, with no further ado, I will show some slides. As an architect, I usually have to have slides. Interesting thing is we live in Nevada County, in Nevada City. It's a little town of 3,000 people. And we put a 34-unit co-housing community right downtown. And one of the interesting things about Nevada County is it's somewhat rural, somewhat iconoclastic, Northern California town. And, one of the, when we were first planning that project, we had 8 people come to the first planning meeting, and 2 of them were Native Americans. And, they didn't say anything through the whole meeting. But at the end of the meeting, I walked up to them and said, hey, I'm so glad you guys are here. You're thinking about moving into this project? And they said, no, not really, but We're so glad that you're doing it. On average, in Nevada County, people live on 5-acre sites is very common. In fact, you have to do a 5-acre site in most of Nevada County. But there's plenty of people who live on 20 acres, 100 acres, etc. So anyway, I asked these guys, are you going to join us? And they said, no, but we're so happy that you're making what amounts to a village here. You, quote unquote, you white people build stuff all over hell and high water, equidistant across the landscape, pretty much consume as much of the landscape as you possibly can. And in this case, you're putting 34 houses on 3.5 acres. And they were just so amazed. And they said, quote unquote, we want to do anything we can to support you. And they were a big support along the way. So it was kind of an interesting part of it. The whole project was extremely interesting. And it started off, very interesting at that level. What makes a community? Well, very much it's created in the duration of making decisions together. Basically, this group, the Spokane Cohousing Group, is very much building this community, not brick by brick, but decision by decision, of which there are considerable decisions to be made. How big are the houses? How many houses? What are the cost range of the houses? How energy efficient are the houses going to be? But in traditional co-housing methodology, they're doing that in a very sophisticated way. Basic co-housing math is 1 + 1 = 3. In other words, I have an idea, you have an idea, and together we come up with a third idea that's better. And I'm finding that over and over again. I consider the Spokane co-housing, which will be unveiled to the co-housing group next. I mean, they know all the pieces. In fact, if you're interested, we have some of the design criteria here that they created with me. But the final drawings are going to be here next week. They were going to be here this week, but we didn't get quite done, so they gave me another week, which my staff is very happy about. They've been working too late. It's very much a village-like setting, and breaking bread plays a big role in that possibility. Not only did they didn't build it brick by brick. They built it decision by decision, but that's only what gets you to the design, through the design phase. After you live there, there's a lot of other gestures that make a huge difference in sustaining the community. Nothing sustains community more than breaking bread. Where I live, 34 houses. We have dinner in the common house available 6 nights a week. So I managed to make it up there about, I'd say, 2 or 3 nights a week, sometimes 1 night a week when I'm out of town a lot. You have to sign up in advance. But there's a lot of things like that bring you back to a more traditional-like setting where people break bread together, for example, and that kind of thing plays a role. And it's not just the sustenance. I mean, we can all get food. Food's not the issue. It's, hey, what are you doing this weekend? I'm going cross-country skiing. Do you want to join me? Hey, did you know that Margaret's, getting a hip replacement next month, and do you think that we should put a little committee together that's going to fulfill the need to support her for the next 6 weeks, probably, in which we've had to do that kind of thing numerous times. And so the common dinners in the co-housing community plays a vast role in gluing that community together over time. Whether it's inside or outside, there's 4 consistent components to co-housing. One is that the future residents play a major role in the design and the creation of the community and the organization. 2 is it's designed to facilitate a community over time, including things like common dinners. 3 is that it's entirely self-managed. And 4 has extensive common facilities. In other words, the common facilities really do supplement the private houses. They really do contribute to the individual house. I often feel like even if my house is only 1,000 square feet, we have a 4,000 square foot common house, so I really have a 5,000 square foot house. But I have, great gourmet cooks up there making dinner for me, which makes it even better. Comes with servants. Don't tell my community I said that, but what makes the common meals work is the kids' room. We have 30 kids. We moved in with 37 kids 11 years ago, and something happens to kids right after dinner. Those carbohydrates have the exact opposite effect that they have on us. We want to, lounge down and have a cup of coffee and, chit chat, and they want to bounce off the walls. What makes the common dinners work is they have a place to go bounce off the walls. This is the central circulation there, and that plays a role in the sustaining the sense of community over time. That facilitates knowing each other, and it's very proximate. Leal here, and her husband had built 2 of their individual houses previously, and she moved in saying to me over and over and over again, Chuck, and I love this whole co-housing thing, this whole community thing, it's all great and everything, but keep in mind that we really care about privacy. She didn't have to tell me more than once, but she chose to. And I'm always, when Kate and I were writing the first book about co-housing, we noticed that about 80% of the time that people spent in their front yard or backyard, they spent in their front yard, and 20% in the backyard, which is the complete inverse of typical single-family houses where you don't know your neighbor. You spend about 80% in your own backyard and 20% in your front yard, even if you have a front porch, which a lot of houses now don't. But anyway, the funny thing about Leal is she has a very nice backyard. I've never seen her in her backyard. She's only been in the front yard. So, generally speaking, one of our challenges in our culture is overcoming our own prejudices about, privacy. She has as much privacy as she wants. She chooses to, be, in the front porch and talk to people as they walk by. Her house is actually the first one that you come to as you walk into the community. I often consider her our Walmart greeter, actually completely, voluntary on her part. So anyway, we have, as a rule, we have way overcompensated for the privacy that we bring to the table as part of our, in my view, our American mythology. Does anybody here know who's made more movies, who starred in more movies than any other actor or actress in our culture? John Wayne. So 126 movies he starred in. That's a lot of pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Which, by the way, I've never actually seen anybody pull themselves up by the bootstraps. I don't know if you guys have. I know that a community can do something like that, and I think with the support of your neighbors, it gives you a leg up, no pun intended, and along those lines. So, the kids, and I was asked to really dwell on kids here tonight because they're really looking for as many more kids as they can possibly get as soon as possible in their group. They just want more families, and that makes sense. It's so funny. Sometimes they'll ask me to stress senior co-housing because they don't have enough seniors, but anyway, they ask me to stress the kids. We have very much what you could only describe as free-range kids. These are 4 kids in our wild area, and they do have, we actually have several acres of open space, and they own the joint, period. The kids just own the joint. But, we also have a music room, and there's lots of, she lives here, and these kids all live here, and there's lots of opportunity for music lessons. Music lessons are happening all the time as well. And it's so easy because it's so proximate. We don't have people schlepping, people around from one end of town to the other to get their violin lesson. And we actually have a fair amount of concerts in our common house as a result of most of the kids have gotten very interested in music. This day they happen to be practicing because the next day, this is a Saturday, on the next day, Sunday, they're going to be doing a concert at a nursing home in town. So they were all very thrilled. But what was so interesting to me is that this happened to be on a Saturday afternoon. This happens to be the same kids on Saturday morning, the same day, interestingly enough. So you can see the varied developmental opportunities for kids in that setting. But, this is really what they spend a lot of time doing, is just figuring out life with their peers. There comes a point where they get more from talking to their peers than they do from their parents and their teachers, etc. So, there's a lot of support here. And it's interesting enough, one of our teenagers wrote a paper last year that said that, and I heard about it, so I asked her if I could read it. And her paper for high school said, no kid who grows up in co-housing would probably become addicted to drugs because there's no holes in their heart. I thought that was her premise. That was her thesis sentence, which I thought was pretty interesting, that a 17-year-old kid would figure that out. Anyway, our little setting here. The kids. I just happened to ask somebody in my office, hey, give me some slides of some kids. And then I was looking through my iPad yesterday, and there's thousands and thousands of photos of the kids growing up in our co-housing. They own the joint, as I mentioned. You know, in 2004, this is a different co-housing community. This one in Cotati, which is 50 miles north of San Francisco, won the National Neighborhood of the Year, 30 houses. And again, back to this point about designing it themselves, the future residents. These parents could make a neighborhood that made sense for those kids in a way that nobody else can. I mean, you get a bunch of bureaucrats and a bunch of bankers and a bunch of business people together and ask them to make a neighborhood that's very kid-friendly. They're just not going to do the same job that these parents will do over and over and over again. It's dead obvious that they make a neighborhood that's kid-friendly, senior-friendly, people-friendly, for Christ's sake. Interestingly enough, this project was, part of a master plan. 3 other neighborhoods were built at the same time, and over again, I hear people say things like, well, co-housing's got all this participation, must take longer. Well, the other 3 projects took 5 years, 5 years, and 7 years. This one took 3 years, start to finish. There's something that happens, especially when you have kids, there's an urgency. Let's get this thing built. And with seniors, I love working with seniors because they're so impatient. One of them told me recently, Chuck, I don't even buy green bananas anymore. Get this thing built. So, I just love the urgency that gets in there. But what's also interesting to me is these other 3 developers had 30 years, 40 years of experience. These moms, who are mostly school teachers, had no experience, and they knew how to put a neighborhood together, and they got Neighborhood of the Year. And none of those other developers got Neighborhood of the Year, basically, in the US of A. That particular year, 1.6 million houses were built in the USA, and this 30-unit project won Neighborhood of the Year. But you can see it when you walk on site. It's palpable. These people know each other. That's the beginning of people caring about each other. That's the beginning of people supporting each other in a meaningful way. This happens to be one that we've finished recently up in Chilliwack, Canada, if you know where that is. We've done 5 projects in Canada now. It's been very interesting. And again, there the kids own the joint too. They just do. Warm and cozy, home away from home, that's what the common facilities should really feel like. I'm an architect, I really care about that stuff. I really care that the place is photographed well and all the rest. But the mantra in our office is, if it doesn't work socially, why bother? We're not just making real estate here. We're actually making places where people know and care about each other for a duration. Interesting thing about this place, this happens to be Mountain View, California, and I just had dinner there a couple nights in a row while I was working on another project in that neighborhood. And it was so interesting to me, I don't know if I have the next slide, no I don't, how much fun they were having. And they've only been moved in about 14 months now. And they were like giddy, it was giddy. And I couldn't help but think about, they had a typical co-housing development where they had to get together with 30 or 40 strangers and carve out what our optimum neighborhood would feel like and look like and be like. But they had done it themselves. There was a considerable history and therefore camaraderie, and it was palpable. They had known they had done something. We had done something. And I think that contributed considerably to the energy in that dining room that night, basically. And to them, gluing as a community. And you feel it, this happens to be back at Cotati as you walk through this community too, people knowing each other. This happened to be my electric bill last year, which my favorite slide actually, minus $83. We have only 1 kilowatt of photovoltaics. But, interestingly enough, none of our 34 households had photovoltaics previous, but there's something about working with other people where you see your potential. None of us had sustainably grown lumber in our houses, but somebody during the design process said, hey, I don't know if anybody here has been to a clear-cut forest lately, but what it does to the animal habitat, what it does to the water quality, what it does to the air quality is considerable. Why don't we consider all sustainably grown lumber, which means not clear-cutting, basically, which meant about $2,000 more per house. And these are a lot of folks who didn't have a lot of extra money, but they're their potential and their values percolated to the top and reinforced each other in ways it's pretty difficult to do when you're isolated. It's harder to get so many things accomplished. And I know that because I just see what we accomplish, a shared electric car. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And it reminds me very much of the shortest poem in the English language. Does anybody know what the shortest poem in the English language is? Me, we. Which means, and if you read about that poem over and over again, the interpretations go something like, I can probably never reach my potential until we reach our potential. And once we reach our potential, it's so much easier. It's formatted so much easier for me to reach my potential. And I really come to see that over and over living in co-housing. And I've lived in co-housing now for about 25 years. 12 years here, 12 years in Emeryville, and then a year in Europe, different co-housing in Denmark. Interestingly enough, how people's, as I was mentioning earlier, their view of their neighbors shift considerably. For example, Meg here, who was about 95 when I took this photo, moved into co-housing about 88, and just died like 2 weeks ago, 1 week short of 100. But when she moved in at 88, her kids had convinced her to move to the parking, to the houses, to a house right near the parking. Because look at Meg, you're 88, right? And a couple years later, she moved to the house farthest from the parking, 700 feet, over 2 football fields, tooling from her car to her house. And one day I just stopped and said, because it's so counterintuitive, I just said, Meg, what are you doing? Why did you do this? And she says, Chuck, one day I realized that my relationship with my neighbors is so much more important than my relationship with my car. And that kind of consciousness sort of builds on itself as you move in and see how much sharing brings to the table. For example, we have 34 houses. We only have 1 lawnmower. I mean, we wouldn't even dream of having more than 1 lawnmower. You'd be kind of like crazy if you imagine having one. I mean, it would be odd. And, sharing is one of the easiest things to do in co-housing. In fact, sometimes I'm often asked, Chuck, what do you think the common denominator is for people who move into co-housing? And I've had to think about it and give it some consideration, and I've come to the conclusion that pretty much everybody who lives in our co-housing community, and just about everyone else that I know of, believe that their own lives would be easier, more convenient, more practical, more economical, more interesting, more fun, more healthy, if they give cooperation the benefit of the doubt. That doesn't mean they will when it doesn't make sense, because almost all decisions in co-housing are made by consensus. So if you don't want to share something, you don't do it. In fact, recently somebody was tooling about in our co-housing community, knocking on people's doors saying, hey, I want to buy a pickup truck. Do you want to buy a pickup truck together? No. And then they'd go to somebody else's house, and apparently no was the only answer he got. And but he floated it. You can float sharing whatever makes sense to you. And you can imagine if you tried that in a regular neighborhood, hey, I'm going to buy a pickup truck. You want to buy a pickup truck together? I think it'd be about 10 minutes before somebody called the cops, basically. So, you could argue that Ayn Rand was correct. We only do things for ourselves. In other words, he and like a lot of people move into co-housing because they think their own life is going to be better, period. Whatever ideology you bring to the table, you're going to find, that, your own life will be much more economical. In fact, somebody did a survey a couple years ago asking 200 different people, how much money did you think you saved per month living in co-housing? And the number ranged from $200 a month to $2,430 in 1 month. That was somebody from Boulder, Colorado, who was able to sell the second car and, just had, her heating bill went from $450 to $20 a month. And she had about a 20 line item thing and all the things that she was saving. I was just having dinner at a senior co-housing community, and some guy was telling me that before he moved into co-housing, he was buying 5 to 6 tanks of gas a month, and now he's buying less than 1 tank of gas a month. 77 years old guy. But you can just see that the advantages at that level compound. So, the project in Spokane. The current building is on Hartson and Garfield on the corner. It's basically a 3-acre site altogether, and there's a couple of buildings on the site, but there's also lots of opportunity for the residents to add, in this case, 27 houses there, and then there's a pretty good sized garden on the south side of the site here, and this is the group forging their new neighborhood from scratch. I mean, that was a blank piece of paper 3 days previous to this photograph. And basically, they spent 2 days or 1.5 days generating a criteria. What would an optimum neighborhood look like to you? Be, pedestrian friendly and spontaneous lifestyle. Green always percolates up, et cetera, et cetera. And there they are on Monday night after finishing the site design. Then this is the Common House Workshop. You can see some of these familiar faces here tonight. Basically prioritizing, I think we had 20 rooms to prioritize, and we'll probably end up with about 15 of them. And but that exercise was critical to understanding, the values. And what's so interesting to me is this site plan, by the way, happens in 2 different rooms by 2 different groups, one half of the group and one half of the group. In other words, they spent 1.5 days generating a criteria for what their new neighborhood should feel like. And theoretically, if they have the same criteria, they should come up with the same neighborhood, basically. And so they worked on it until it was basically the same neighborhood, until it merged to become the same neighborhood. And then similarly, in this case, they were broken up into 3 separate groups to prioritize, where the money would go for common facilities. And it's pretty astounding, once they have spent a day generating a criteria, how much they saw, for example, the importance of, for example, breaking bread together. That was the first priority in terms of, what they're going to invest in and such. And then a couple weeks ago, we designed the private houses, which you can see, we have those little criteria books up front here. And that was a hoot, kind of. I mean, it was fine. It's always challenging, actually, because in this case, you see 5 or 6 households who are trying to merge to one house type. And then another 5 or 6 households that are trying to merge to one house type. And then another few households that are trying, because those are the kind of practices you have to employ to make things affordable. And by the way, it turns out to be one of the priorities of the group was to make this project as affordable as possible. And I say that, and it's interesting because I think there's a feeling, I certainly felt it, that by having all these people at the table designing one house, it's a better house. And when we first started designing co-housing in the U.S., the first one was finished in 1991. We started basically in 1989. Our first book came out in 1988. Kate and I actually coined the word co-housing. If you look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, it states our names, which is kind of amazing. Who would guess that they did things like that? But anyway, when we first started out, it was surprising. About every other project, somebody in the group would have way too much money, and they would want a custom house. So we basically do them a shell, and then with all the other households design different houses. And then what they started to see over and over again, I certainly saw it, and unfortunately the people who spent $300 a square foot designing a custom house found out that the people who spent $100 a square foot in construction only had a better house, because there was something about this joint wisdom at the table, and they turned out to be better houses as a result. This happens to be Boulder, Colorado, and one of their priorities for their site design was that as many houses as possible could see the bike shed, because and I heard this kind of story over and over there, they go biking every single morning at 10 a.m. Whoever's here, it's usually 3 to 7 people at the bike shed. Many houses as possible could see it, but what they exclaimed and what they do in the creation, of these little books about their project is talk about the behavior that they want after they move in. I want to see that Margaret's going for a bike ride because I haven't talked to her for a couple weeks, and I know they always stop and get a cappuccino at the inn, so I have a chance to chat with her there. or hey, if they can go biking, I can go biking too. You know, really prompting yourselves to think about the behavior you want to induce a couple years down the line. And I think they did a great job of it. This happens to be their outdoor dining scene there. Less, yeah. I'm going to hustle through. This happens to be Bellingham Cohousing, if any of you over in that neighborhood. Started by this 86-year-old gentleman who wanted to live with his grandkids and his daughter and son-in-law, but not with them, if you know what I mean. They live in separate houses, but in the same neighborhood. They have coffee every morning at 10. They don't. The other ones go for bicycles. These guys have coffee every morning, but then they probably go bicycling afterwards. This is one that we just happened to finish in Port Townsend, California, and really like the way they just moved in. But they have already got considerable amount of cultural activities planned in their common house. You know, I think this is my last slide. Oh, except for the books. And you know, this is a scale that I came up with a few years ago. You know, when you look at the relationship that people have in the suburbs, it's pretty low. People often ask, you know, Chuck, what if you have acrimony or disagreement in the co-housing? And you will, you know, just like you do in a small town. You know, the Hatfields and the McCoys can be real. I know, I lived in a small town. But the one thing that happens in co-housing that mitigates that, in suburbans, you don't really have any relationships, so you don't have anything to be perturbed about. But here, you know, what time are we going to have dinner and stuff like that? You have things to get annoyed about. There's opportunities to get annoyed. But these co-housers, they spend a conscious amount of time figuring out how to work with other people. It's not taken lightly. It's a conscious act that we're going to figure out how to reach 3. 1 + 1 = 3. And I find over and over again, I don't care how much money you have, I don't care how much, if you have a site or not, it's how well you work together that makes the success of these projects. And these guys work really well together. You know, co-housing is a lot more than a soundbite. I hope you see that tonight. Therefore, we wrote the book, 80,000 words. But it's fun, I hear. So I want to encourage you to pick up a copy if you want to know more. And I'm going to sign them if you want me to sign one. I'd love to sign one for you. So that's it. Thank you, guys. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
So could you maybe go over, like, the legalities of, like, ownership? Like, how is that structured? And then, like, financing, or is it cash? I mean, how are people buying in, essentially?
I'm going to let Mariah answer part of that, but the overarching legal financial structure is basically condos. And I know that you have plenty of condos in Spokane, and so they're basically condominiums. So you have an undivided interest in the common facilities. The investment is different. I mean, I know you guys have a buy-in. Basically, there's a progressive investment as you start to participate in the project. So do you want to answer what it takes to get into now? And by the way, if anybody gets in this week, next week we're doing what's called the Design Closure Workshop, so you'd be able to come to that workshop.
So because you're buying essentially a condo, whether it's ultimately a townhome or a flat in the development, if life happens and you need to move back to the East Coast, you sell that unit just like you would a normal unit on the marketplace. And we've seen throughout peaks and valleys in the housing market that co-housing tends to retain its value better than conventional units. And we're self-financing the development phase of the project. And so each household is expected to plan for about 20% of the ultimate cost of their unit to be in the project before we move to the next stages. So to be a member in our development LLC called the Perry Group, because that's the neighborhood we're building in, is a $500 non-refundable fee. And then there's unsecured loans that are made to the LLC up to that 20% of the cost of your unit to float the costs of hiring our professionals and making our dreams a reality. So I hope that answers the question. If there's more detailed, we also have an associate membership. So if you're not ready to bite the bullet and dive in feet first, we have a trial membership called an associate member where you can pay $150 And that saves your spot in line to select your unit. And there are a limited number of each unit type available, so if you have particular needs, you might turn in your associate check and continue to do your due diligence and meet with your financial planner and family members, et cetera, et cetera. You have 3 months to make the full investment. So we're happy to answer more of those questions as they come up. The first payment for the unsecured loans is $2,000, and then you catch up to where the rest of the group is at on a regular payment plan that works for your family that we can approve.
I wondered if you could speak to the different flavors of co-housing. So when co-housing is coming together around particular goals like permaculture or inclusion for people with disabilities, and I just wonder if you have any experience with that, or maybe you have resources that you could recommend.
Yeah, are there, what are the different flavors of co-housing? I kind of like that question. It's an interesting question because it's kind of twofold. Definitely every project is different. Spokane will have its unique aspects. Cotati had its unique aspects. Nevada City has its own aspects. But what kind of surprises me at some level is how the human condition is so consistent, actually, whether it's raising children or growing older or, busy, hectic lifestyles and mitigating that to some level. It's kind of surprising to me at some level to what extent similar issues come up project after project. For example, in the context of designing co-housing and prioritizing those common facilities, breaking bread has always worked out to be number one. And I know it's not just because I stress it, because I actually don't stress it that much in the creation of the project. But that's actually, I think, an increasing priority, because I don't know about Washington, but California, I think every other person is a foodie now. So, and something happens when you only have to cook once a month, that you really do this bang-up job. And, it's kind of ridiculous, the pedigree of the tomatoes, that we're having. And we're growing them all now. And, and I don't know, I don't know when exactly it happens, but it seems like after about 60, growing tomatoes becomes a competitive sport. I don't know if you guys noticed that up here. But that said, there's also lots of nuances that are unique. I mean, the Spokane group seems to be a lot about canning and showing off their canning too. We have lots of display area for the canning. I noticed that in a restaurant too, so that must be part of the culture here, huh? Yeah, okay. Where I live, we're not far from the ski slopes, so we have a huge storage of shared ski equipment. I mean, you could get every kind of snowshoe and snowboard, and it's all common, basically. One person took on that project and made sure that every kid can do whatever they want, whenever they want, on the slopes, basically, and for nothing, because it's all been donated and hand-me-downs and all the rest. So basically, every culture, in my experience, learns to sort of cooperate at their optimum level, every subculture. Interestingly enough, we just finished a project in Stillwater, Oklahoma. Far over half of the residents were actually Republican. I'm not going to get political here, but it's not that usual that happens. And what was striking to me is how their life issues tend to be the same as our life issues. And so I don't know why I find that so striking, but in their co-housing community felt, like that their first priority was figuring out how to make life, more convenient, more practical, more interesting, more fun. Same priorities percolate to the top over and over again. So, yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. Sir.
Right now we're living in an HOA with like about 14 units, and we have a board of directors and all this kind of thing. So it leads me to ask, what kind of, administration do you have? A board of directors? Do you have? I know I was the president of that group for about 6 years, and it was sort of like I was a mayor.
Yeah, governance. Yeah. Yeah, right. Governance. I'm going to hit on that real quick. Although these are financially and legally basically condominiums, once they're built, I want to Mariah mentioned that it's an LLC before. Nobody lets you pre-sell a condominium. So you're just buying into a business venture at this point. But anyway, but the governance looks nothing like any typical condo. I mean, nothing like it. For example, where I live, every adult's on the board. Typically, it's 5 or 7 people. And by the way, where I live, it's all done by consensus. So somebody would argue, oh, consensus, that sounds like it takes a long time. You know, I wish I could compare how long it takes compared to, you know, the condo down the street, where A, nothing ever happens. I mean, the only way to avoid, you know, I mean, and they only have to get 4 out of 7 votes and nothing ever happens. That thing looks the same as it was when it was built 25 years ago. It looks exactly the same. They wouldn't even conceive of voting to change the color because it would be nothing but acrimony. Something happens when you have to get consensus, but and more importantly, something happens when you give a damn about your neighbor. You know, if that tree that's diseased is in front of your house, and I'm on the landscape committee, I'm going to spend a lot of quality time with you saying, hey, I don't know how you feel about this tree, but let me walk you through the problems with it, and we should have a good chat about why the tree committee thinks it's got to go. In other words, there's an immense amount of deference and respect that in a condo association, I'm always amazed. Nope, we voted. It's out of here.
Hi, my name is Dale Rogers. I work for a housing counseling group called SNAP. We are in the process of developing some low-income and lower-income housing.
There's a chair right here. I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying that I work for a nonprofit called SNAP. I'm a housing counselor. And we are developing some low-income and lower-income properties. We haven't really got started yet, but I was just wondering how. I don't have a lot of power in this group. You know, I have some influence maybe, but I'd like to see maybe someone from Mariah's group of Spokane Cohousing come and talk to the board of directors of SNAP to see if we can do something for you, if we can help in any way.
Oh, right on. Thank you. So the question is, what's the nonprofit?
SNAP.
SNAP. I like the name of that. So the question is, if SNAP can actually help. You know, I wouldn't be surprised at some point they're going to come talk to you about, you know, how to, you know, whether it's Section 8 vouchers or something to get a few affordable houses into the project. That would be nice. And by the way, if you guys are influencing other housing projects, I can't encourage you enough to start, you know, instilling, you know, the community aspect more than anything else. It's amazing. It seems like half of our projects nowadays are, you know, Chuck, we can't do a co-housing for one reason or another, but we want you guys your firm to bring as many co-housing-esque components to the table, and including a couple of recently finished homeless projects. So, yeah, thank you very much. They'll be visiting. You have a card?
Yes.
You know, just give it to a resident, would you? Thank you.
So you showed us a lot of slides. People were just moving in. We're in the honeymoon phase, and so happy to be together. And
so happy together.
And you know, eventually, either founders move away, pass away. But just I'm curious to see, do those feelings last, and what happens when people who weren't involved initially move in?
Yeah, good questions. The life cycle, I guess is how you described it, co-housing. Well, it's two or three different ways to look at it. One is that, you know, the experiences become richer and richer and richer. We have, you know, 5 people who've died in our community because they moved in at 88 and stuff like that. And we have done a lot of co-care for those residents. You know, in some cases, their kids lived not far, and we still did the majority of the care in the co-housing community itself. So, you know, we've had a lot of experiences doing that together, and that makes for a richer, deeper experience than it's not just about the honeymoon. It's about, you know, how we grapple with real life issues, basically, over time. And you know, the early residents, the founders, the early residents, they basically create a culture in a community, just like a small town, basically. Now, you could argue that small towns have a whole other dynamic, and they do, because they're often tied to economics that the co-housing is not tied to, because very few people, if any, ever work on the site, basically. Some do, a couple, but it's not significant. And the culture is the key thing. So we agreed a long time ago that we would do dinner 6 nights a week. That is what sustains the culture over time. We agreed a long time ago to have a maintenance committee and a landscape committee and all these things. We agreed a long time ago that you would cook dinner once a month, that you would belong to a couple committees. We've institutionalized a minimum of guarantee that we will sustain a sense of community over time. That said, it's possible for it to subside a little bit. It does happen, basically. It happens most likely when the agreements weren't in place before they moved in, and I'll just make that warning to this group too. Basically, the group, like we have to cook once a month, that was in place before you moved in. There have been co-housing communities who moved in and people said, oh, well, I don't want to cook, whatever. And that puts a damper on the community over time. We had in Emeryville, we had somebody wanting to move in, and they said, hey, well, what if I don't want to cook once a month? And I'll never forget one of our true elders in that community. She said, you know what, Jim? Her name happened to be Jim. There's a whole world out there for you if you don't want to cook for your neighbor. Here, we cook for our neighbors. And so basically, you can see how it's okay to have a culture, basically, at some basic level, assuming it's healthy, and it seems to be. And so as long as there's, in our case, 50 adults who like cooking for each other, which there seems to be, then we're fine. I suppose somebody will marry in one of these days who doesn't like to cook, and we'll see if we can get them to just assist or clean up or something like that. But you put a flywheel together. There's a great book, or I shouldn't say that. There's a book called Happily Ever After in Co-Housing. So you might look at that one. It's not here tonight.
My question is about when you live in a collective environment, say in a dorm room or something like that, a lot of times the shared facilities doesn't belong to anybody, so nobody has to take care of it, and things can get left, in poor condition or broken or whatever. So how do you handle that in co-housing?
That's a really good question. That book talks about that too, Happily Ever After in Co-Housing. I think it was Machiavelli who said, it was like 1500, there's two political realities. One is a divide and conquer, and our landscape like that for the most part is very much the case. Put everybody in their box, watching TV, divide and conquer is a great way to manipulate the public, still happening. And the tragedy of the commons, which means that if the public thinks that somebody else will take care of that, then you're right, it'll fall apart. And that's why the volunteer society is so important to make work. Well, that volunteer society works best at this scale. That's why the Danes are so adamant about not having more than 50 adults, because you know and care about each other. In other words, I know that if I leave the workshop, we have a generous sized workshop, about 600 square feet. If I leave that a mess, I'm going to upset Tony, and I'm going to upset Jeff, and I'm going to upset Mikos. All these people I really care about, and I'm actually pretty accountable. They know who was in there last night. There's public, the Danes would argue more than 50 people, in other words, and there's common. And when it's common, it means that I have this sense of accountability to my neighbors because it's of that scale. And when it's public, I don't have an accountability. So when you think about the dorms, usually there are a number of people that it's actually hard to pin on, and they don't necessarily feel that accountable. You feel pretty accountable here. You feel pretty accountable because, I used to say, I don't want to piss off Margaret on Thursday if I'm going to ask her to watch my kid on Friday. And that symbiosis is real, basically. And so, I found myself cleaning up the common house after common dinner that I'd made a lot better than I cleaned up my own house, actually. And in fact, I felt like everybody did that. That thing was, generally speaking, pretty pristine because I felt more, you can manipulate your spouse, unfortunately, but you can't manipulate the co-housers. You don't get away with it at the same level. I thought the question you were going to ask is, what if somebody moves in that annoys the hell out of me? Because that usually somebody asks that, so I'll just answer that. It even gets much worse than that. What if it turns out to be you? That's what, it seems like the people who worried about it the most, they tended to be the most difficult. But anyway, there's lots of opportunities getting involved with the group early to figure out if this group of people makes sense to you. And usually if they don't make sense to you, you bow out early. And that's probably a lot of reason why folks get a lot of the reasons folks get along so well is they have grown to not only become better participants, but they've sort of in an organic way said, I can jive with this group or I can't, and they invite themselves out if they don't. So, hey, thanks very much for coming, you guys.
Coming to you from Washington State, this is KYRS Medical Lake Spokane 88.1 and 92.3 FM.